Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We're going to give everyone just another minute to jump on, but in the meantime, we would love to hear from you in the chat. We are halfway through the series now, and so we're wondering what questions you're still trying to answer related to grocery business transition. So let us know in the chat what questions you still have, and we will get started shortly. Okay, well, hello everyone. Welcome to the 5th webinar of the series, Keeping Groceries Alive, Successful Ownership Transitions for Rural Grocery Stores. My name is Erica Blair. I am a program manager with the Rural Grocery Initiative at Kansas State University. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are halfway through the series already, and we've covered a lot of ground. So we've talked about different ownership models, preparing for business transition, assessing markets and community needs. So there's a lot that goes into a business transition plan. And we know that this is such a critical topic because these plans help to ensure that grocery stores can continue serving their communities. And they not only support food access, but they also support the financial security of grocers. So our hope is that this webinar series will put this topic front of mind for both grocers and community members. And we hope you'll find plenty of good information to make sure that your grocery store's transition is a success. So during last week's webinar, we talked about how a grocery store's ownership transition can open up opportunities to assess the market and community needs. It was a really great webinar. If you missed it, or if you wanted to watch any of the previous webinars, you can find the recordings at ruralgrocery.org under the events tab. So next slide. And today we will be discussing planning your business. So business plans can help guide new owners and managers and promote the business to potential partners and funders. So we will hear from Imogene Harris with Network Kansas and Jack Harwell with the Kansas Small Business Development Center. And they'll talk about how to get started on a business plan. And then I will share a few grocery specific considerations toward the end. Next slide. So before we begin, as always, we want to thank our incredible team of partners who helped create this webinar series. We couldn't have done it without them. We also want to thank our sponsor, the Ewing Marion Kauffman Foundation, for making this project possible. And finally, I have some quick housekeeping items. So first, this webinar is being recorded. Again, you can find the recordings at ruralgrocery.org, located under the events tab. And you'll see the closed captioning feature has been turned on. So you can control your individual caption settings by clicking the live transcript button on your Zoom panel. And if you have any technical questions about this or anything else, we have our students, Lauren and Jess, working behind the scenes, and they can help you with any technical issues. And finally, we will have time at the end for Q&A. So if you have questions during the presentation, please ask them in the Q&A box rather than the chat box. And that should just help us keep track of your questions and make sure we're not missing anything. You can also click the like button if someone has asked your question already, and that will actually push the question toward the top. So feel free to continue using the chat box if you have ideas or comments, but again, for specific questions, please use the Q&A box. Okay, well, with that, we are ready to get started, and we will begin today with Imogene Harris with Network Kansas, who will share with us some of the first steps you can take as an entrepreneur in Kansas. So Imogene, I will go ahead and turn it over to you.
Great. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Erica. I am Imogene Harris with Network Kansas, and I just want to thank the Rural Grocery Initiative and K-State for inviting Network Kansas to be a part of this webinar today. Next slide. Just as a quick background or kind of overview of Network Kansas, we are an entrepreneurial support organization with a mission to connect small businesses, including grocers, to the resources they need to start and grow. Network Kansas ourselves, may not have all the answers, but our goal is to connect you to the resource partners in your area that have the expertise to help you in your business. We have a referral center, part of Network Kansas, that you can call or email with questions, and my colleagues do a great job of identifying the prime resources to connect you to across the state of Kansas. And I do have a slide at the end of my little part of this with the contact info for our referral center. Next slide. So when thinking of starting a business, you can see here, this is kind of our main list of our top partners we're likely to connect you to. So this includes our Kansas Small Business Development Centers, who have a really deep knowledge of business planning, and of course you're going to get to hear more about their guidelines and resources here in a few minutes. Another one we send folks to is SCORE, which is a group of like retired business owners who are helping to mentor new business owners. We also find that the local economic development organizations can be a great resource. So either they're going to have just different maybe local resources for small businesses, whether that's for business planning or financial, or maybe there's just other kind of support programs there locally. It's just somebody kind of good to know in your community are those economic development groups. Network Kansas, my organization, we also have what are called entrepreneurship communities or e-communities. These are often led by the economic development organizations. They're countywide, and they have access to different development programs and financial resources. We have 66 of them across the state of Kansas. Most of them are countywide, and most of them are rural. So those can be a good resource too. And then also in this case, since we're talking about grocery stores, the Rural Grocery Initiative would likely be a resource we would want to connect you to. So that's kind of our top list there. Next slide. So to kind of walk you through an example of how this might work and how we were able to connect a rural entrepreneur to some resources, Tecklenburg Farms here, they had actually already connected to their local economic development and small business support organization in Hutchinson. And through that, they decided to use one of the e-community programs, development programs called Ice House. And this is related to like the entrepreneurial mindset. It's almost like pre-business planning kind of thinking. And our referral center conducts follow-ups as part of their engagement with small businesses. And in their follow-up to the Ice House program participants, including Tecklenburg Farms, they learned that since using the program and since connecting with their local business planning resources, Tecklenburg Farms was now ready to start looking for funding to expand their project. So we were able to connect them to the Kansas Healthy Food Initiative, and they were ultimately awarded a small matching grant. So in this case, this group had sort of already identified the planning resources there in their community, but had they not, and had they reached out to us first, that's same folks we would have sent them to. And so in addition to connecting them to KHFI. So what's just fun about this example, though, that I really like is that Nowhere Kansas doesn't always get to see sort of businesses moving through each stage. Sometimes we just kind of connect them and they're just kind of out there and we might follow up, but they may not come back through one of our programs. We may not see them again. And so to see Tecklenburg Farms go through sort of this pre-planning, we knew they were connected locally, and then they had, been able to develop a plan and be ready, but they were asking now, hey, how can we find funding for this project? So it's just really kind of neat to see their progression. Next slide. So just to wrap up, again, this is our contact information for our referral center. You're going to hear from some other great resources today, but just know if you're not sure where to start or who specifically you're trying to contact in the community, you can certainly reach out to our referral center and they'll get you where you need to go to start planning your business. And now I will turn it over to one of these great resources, Jack Harwell with the KSBDC, who will take you through the kind of nitty-gritty work of making a business plan.
Thank you, Imogene. So again, I'm Jack Harwell. I'm with the Kansas Small Business Development Center, and I'm going to talk today about how to build a business plan. So next slide. Before we do that, I have a question. I'm just curious what the audience experience is with business planning. So if you could kind of give us an idea where you are with that. And we're also want to understand what your role is in grocery business, in the rural groceries. Okay, so a lot without the experience, and that's great because that's why we're here. And we have, so that's about 37%. And then there's quite a few that have been involved either helping others or writing a plan. So that's good. So a good mix. And a lot of support for groceries in the audience there. So we appreciate that. Okay, thank you. Next slide. So one of the things that we always start with at the SBDC when we're working with small businesses and doing business planning is to really focus or emphasize feasibility. Feasibility means that it will work, that whatever you plan will actually succeed. And so we recommend these activities kind of leading up to a decision on whether you want to go or no go with your business plan, starting with developing your idea, really understanding what your idea is, what the definition of the business or the business model, and then any objectives you have personally, they need to be kind of mixed into this as well. And then the next step would be do some market analysis. You want to understand the industry. Obviously, you want to understand any competition you have. And then most importantly, you need to understand your target market. And we'll talk a little bit about that, and I'll share some tools to help you with your market analysis. And then the next step would be to understand your requirements. What kind of experience you need or you need to hire, the knowledge that you bring to the table or you need to bring in, the amount of time it's going to take for you to operate this business, and any legal issues to address, but then also, very important, what are the financials of this business? And then once you've done this homework, then you're in a good position to make a decision to go or no go. And we always say no go is not a failure. No go means that either you avoided starting a business or entering a business that doesn't make sense, or you have an opportunity to reevaluate and go back up and kind of go through this process again, maybe refine a few things. And then at the end of the day, decide to go or no go. Again, no go is not a failure. It's maybe a recognition that this could be a failure. And then hopefully we got a plan that we can go with. So next slide. And once you have that information and you've kind of made the decision to go, then we need to build this plan formally. And what I show here is the components of a business plan. It starts with the executive summary, which is just summarizing the rest of the plan and giving a financial summary. The strategic plan, we start by talking about the industry, kind of a background of the circumstances in the industry. Is it growing or shrinking? Things like that. What are the goals of the business and the business owner? A little description and expansion on the products and services that you're going to provide. What's the ownership structure and the conversion strategy? So we're talking about business transition. And so these last two components, the ownership structure and the conversion strategy, are very important components in this plan. And then the next section of the business plan is your marketing plan. We'll talk about it later, but we got a SWOT analysis, customer persona that we recommend that you work through, and then some market analysis, and then kind of lay out what your marketing strategy is to grow the business. The fourth section is the operational plan. That's the details, the nitty-gritty that I think Imogene mentioned. The operations activities, just kind of a description of what's going to happen in that business on a day-to-day level, what kind of accounting system you're going to use, who's the management, what kind of labor are you going to require, and then how are you organizing that labor? And then facilities and equipment. A lot of times, especially in grocery, you have to have a place and you have to have equipment to keep stuff cool and other types of equipment. So definitely need to include that. And then finally, the financial plan. And you want to have a good plan for how you're going to raise the money. And in a business transition, especially with employee ownership or other kinds of collaborative ownership models, the funding plan could be very complex. And so there may be quite a bit of the plan written about the funding. And then the financial projections. We have a spreadsheet that will be one of your handouts that we can provide to everybody. We have a spreadsheet at the SBDC that we use. It's quite daunting, but we're here to help you go through it. But what it can do is build a 3-year financial projections, P&L, balance sheet, and cash flow statements for your business. So those are the building blocks of a business plan. Next slide. Now, we've got a lot of materials for you because this is a brief conversation and this is a pretty deep subject. So we've got a lot of materials for you. One thing that we provided is what we call our business plan guidelines. And it's essentially an outline of what a business plan might look like. And that's just a PDF document that you could use if you wanted to just start from scratch and write a plan. Next slide. We also have or can offer the opportunity for you to use an online planning tool. It's called the Fort Hays Business Plan Creator, and it's free to use. You just have to register, and again, no cost, and your information will be kept confidential. Next slide. And there's a link up here on that slide, by the way, to access the Business Plan Creator. What I like about this tool is it's very structured. You can develop a plan online and then save it, download it to a Word document, and kind of finish it up, give it the formatting, and maybe add some images, graphs, charts, pictures. You can do all that. That's not possible in the Plan Creator, but once you've built the narrative, the document, the words, then you can download it. And really what makes it most valuable to use is the suggestions and help. So you can see at the bottom of the slide here, I've got an image of the screen, and on the right-hand side is where you actually type in the information, your plan. But the left-hand side gives you a lot of help, a lot of suggestions on what might be included in this plan, questions that you might want to answer in this plan. So and by the way, it follows the same outline that the business plan guidelines follows, so they're consistent. So if you start working with one and you go to the other one, then they won't be confusing to you, hopefully. Next slide. And then we're going to offer, as I mentioned, other business planning tools, and I'm going to walk through them just real briefly. Some of them I may not give you enough information to satisfy you, and just keep in mind that the SBDC is here to help small businesses in Kansas. So you can certainly reach out. You can reach us through the Rural Grocery Initiative or directly, and we can see if we can help you. But I have some tools for the strategic planning section, and then, as I mentioned, the financial projection spreadsheet. So next slide. The IBIS World Report is it's about a 35 to 40 page document. It gives you good information about the industry, some background information that helps you write your business plan, but more importantly, maybe help you get a little bit more insight into the grocery business and the trends. You might notice that I've got convenience stores as the title of this report. Actually, we're providing two reports. One is grocery and supermarket, and then this one's grocery store or convenience stores. And I included them both because I feel like a lot of times a rural grocery is maybe a mix of the two. And so I wanted to give you as much information as I could. But you can see just a small sample of what kind of information you'd get from these reports. Again, 35 to 40 pages, so a lot of content, but they can give you information about where the industry is and where it's going. Next slide. I mentioned SWOT analysis, and highly recommend that every business plan contain a SWOT analysis. And if you're not familiar with SWOT, it stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And you can see here how it's kind of laid out, and this is kind of a standard format. And the idea is to identify these aspects of your business so they can be addressed. Now, obviously, strengths and opportunities, that's really what you're going to be leaning into in your business plan. The business plan itself is seeking an opportunity or describing an opportunity. But you want to put a little more detail in here about, just some bullet detail about what are those opportunities that make this venture possible. And then the strengths are your internal capabilities. So one thing I didn't mention, the strengths and weaknesses are internal looking. So you're looking at yourself, your business, and describing what are your strengths and weaknesses. Opportunities and threats are actually external factors. Opportunities that are outside of your control and threats that are outside of your control. And you can see that, you probably figured it out, but strengths and opportunities are positive, and then weaknesses and threats are negative. And because of that kind of negative connotation on weaknesses and threats, a lot of people tend to kind of underplay those or not want to talk about them. But keep in mind that the people reading your business plan, especially if you're seeking funding and investment, they're pretty savvy people and probably understand to some degree what are threats and weaknesses of your business. So just not talking about them is not going to do you any service. What we recommend is you talk about them, but you also talk about what are you going to do to address them. So for example, if one of my weaknesses is I'm going to bring in a meat department, but I don't know anything about fresh meat or butchering, that's a weakness. What am I going to do about it? I'm going to hire a butcher. Okay, that'll work. So again, don't hold back on strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Speak them all, but also speak to the mitigation efforts that you're going to undertake to kind of soften those weaknesses and threats. Next slide, please. The next very important analysis that I recommend you do. Oh, by the way, one last thing about the SWOT analysis. Again, there's a template out there. It's a PDF and it's fillable, so you can use it to do your SWOT analysis. So anyway, with customer persona, I think every business needs to really get clear on who their persona is. And this is really just describing a fictional character, but they define your target customer. And it's really critical that you get a true understanding of who we're chasing, what customers do we want. And I sometimes get pushback when I talk about customer persona because it's talk about one person, and they say, well, wait a minute, I want more than one customer. If I describe one person, then I'm really limiting myself. But the reality is, what you're doing is you're describing the most common characteristics of the customers that make up your ideal customer. But there's also kind of what I call a halo effect around this persona. So there's a lot of other people that will be attracted to your messaging. If you target your messaging toward your persona, a lot of other people will feel resonance to that and respond positively. So don't be afraid of being very specific on who your character is. Of course, when you're doing your demographics, you might want to give yourself ranges like age range, not 56 years old, but maybe 45 to 60 or something like that. So, be thoughtful there, but otherwise, it's really good, again, that you get a very focused persona. And some businesses have more than one persona. I worked at Radio Shack for 10 years. I don't know if y'all remember those guys, but we had 5 personas. It was a $4 billion company, so that made sense to us. You might want to have 2, maybe, in the grocery business, especially if you're thinking about bringing in a new product category. You might want to build a persona for that category because you might be bringing in a new set of customers besides the normal loyal customers you already have. So it's okay to have more than one, but don't have a whole bunch of them because obviously it gets a little bit difficult to manage and keep straight in your head. But at the end of the day, what the customer persona does is it informs your marketing strategy and tells you what you should be thinking about and what kind of messaging you need to give to your audience so it resonates to the right people. And again, we have a template for this, PDF fillable with some help to help you along. Next slide. So I'm just curious, I would guess that most of you may not have created a persona, but in your mind, or as you think about your customers in the past, have you considered the other aspects of the persona besides demographics? Okay, so some of you thought about it. Shopping behaviors, good. A lot of people think about that, and that's obviously an important aspect of the persona. Really getting into how they progress down that pipeline or that funnel of shopping. That's certainly important. Okay, next slide. So next thing I wanted to talk about is assortment planning, because I would guess that if you're looking to transition a grocery store in rural Kansas and you're thinking about what your product offerings are, you might see the need to enhance what you offer your customers. And so what I'm going to go through here is just a few steps on how we can plan our assortment. So before you start, as I mentioned earlier, you really need to have your SWOT and your persona kind of figured out. Those are key inputs to the process. And then when you're thinking through assortment planning, think at the category level. So don't think about individual items that you're going to bring in, but think about it as at a category level, like a meat market would be a category versus beef, which would be closer to an item level. So think about categories and do some research. You want to look around. I've got some online tools to help you with that research. We'll talk about those in a minute. And then you also want to involve other parties. Bring in as many minds as you can into this process, assuming that they're vested in this and they have an interest in your success. But doing it alone, you miss a little bit of the creativity and the collaboration that you could get with other folks. So once you've kind of prepared and ready to move to the first step, you want to look around for ideas. Just go crazy. Look online at all the different things that people are doing around the country. There's a lot of good information on the internet about what other businesses like yours are doing. Talk around, talk to people that you know or don't know, and just ask them, is this something you think would be helpful in our store or in our town? Look around and see what rural grocers are doing, but don't just stop there. Also look at what urban grocers are doing, because there's a lot of times, as you know, the urban businesses kind of sometimes can lead trends. It's not always that case, and I've seen rural businesses generate some pretty cool trends, but just don't be too narrow in your search, I guess, is my main point. And then make a really long list of possibilities, even if you're skeptical if it would work. We'll figure out whether it works later on. Really what you want is just a long laundry list of possibilities for your assortment, so you have a lot to choose from. And then the next step would be to do the research to start filtering out which of these assortment possibilities might make sense for your business. So, do some research on what your customer preferences are in your area. And again, we'll talk about how that might work in a minute. Use your persona to filter it. So if you've targeted a certain group and you're bringing in an assortment, obviously you want that assortment to resonate with that audience. Again, if you're trying to create a new audience, then you might have that secondary persona that you could use to kind of help you make that decision. And then, of course, you want to estimate the numbers. And when I do assortment planning, I look at it as unit sales and gross profit. Revenue is important, but really what's most important is your gross profit. And those that know me will, every time I talk about gross profit, I just have to say that gross margin or gross profit is the most important number in your business. It generates the cash that you use to pay the overhead and pay yourself. So limit your analysis to unit sales and gross profit, and I think that'll make it a more clear, understandable story. And then the last step, I guess I missed a numbering there, but that's step 4, it says. It really should be 3. First, you want to list all your assumptions. So what are the assumptions that you're making as you develop these numbers and you did this filtering? So why did you choose this assortment? What are those assumptions? And then next you want to do is plot each opportunity to show profitability and then how much it costs to implement. And I've got a little matrix that I've developed on the next page to kind of help you think through this. And then you want to validate your assumptions with your potential customers. So you've kind of done your research, you've got a short list of possibilities, you've got the assumptions that backed up your reasoning for why you chose them, but you want to make sure those assumptions are correct. And the only real way to do that is to talk to customers. Next slide. And so these are the 4 main considerations that you should keep in mind when you're doing assortment planning. First is your total annual margin. dollars or gross profit dollars. Again, you want to do it in dollars. You also want to watch the percent of sales in this analysis. And then you want to understand any startup costs. And that would mean like if you need to bring in a piece of equipment like a big cooler or something, if you were doing a meat market, you might have to bring in some cutting equipment. I'm not a butcher, so I don't know what you call them, but things that cut meat, you want to bring that in. You might need to do some training, maybe get somebody certified, some outside training you have to pay for. And then you probably need to bring in a starting inventory. And so you need to kind of tabulate all those costs so you understand those. And then on top of that, you might have some annual costs. And if it's an item that involves inventory, then, or a category that involves inventory, then you want to understand what are you going to have to carry as inventory every year on average. And then is there any labor required? You know, if it's a service offering, you're most likely to have some labor, or you know, maybe some back office support, maybe, you know, other labor that's involved in making this assortment available to your customers. And then when you're looking at your annual costs, you want to amortize your startup costs. So instead of lumping your startup costs into the total equation, really what you want to do is you want to take that startup cost and divide it by some number of months over in the future, and kind of allocate those costs on an annual basis to spread them out. And typically you probably want to, if it's a lot of equipment involved, you probably want to spread it out over 7 years or so. And then lastly, very important in retail, especially in a smaller footprint that a lot of rural grocers are in, space. Space is very important. The floor space that this assortment or this service is going to take up, you know, how much space is it going to require to display or offer that service? And then in the back room, you know, you're going to have space dedicated to this assortment in the back. And so those are the considerations that you should keep in mind as you're kind of figuring out and doing your analysis and making your comparisons. I've got a couple of links that I thought might be helpful to you. You see them on the right-hand side at the bottom. There's an article, a blog article on assortment planning that I think is pretty good. And then a video. The video is actually talks about Ray Kroc and how he mapped out how McDonald's would work. And I know it's a different industry, but I think there's some lessons learned about thinking it through, and that's the point of the video. And then the next slide, please. So I've developed this matrix to help you kind of sort through the information and make decisions. And so really what you're trying to do is, if you recall, what I'd suggest in the beginning is you want to consider profitability and the cost to implement when you're making these assortment decisions. And so what I recommend you do is you place each assortment that you're considering in one of these squares in the matrix. On the bottom right-hand side, you'll see this square is low profitability, low cost to implement. So, you know, that might be an option for you. It really depends on the details. My caution here is just be careful and consider your space requirements, which a lot of times is ignored. If you move to the square above on the top left, this is a high margin product with a low cost to implement. That could be a star. That might be one of your strongest assortments in the business. So most likely you're going to want to pursue that one. And on the right-hand side, if it's low margin and high cost to implement, it's probably a dog. So the right-hand bottom column, corner is a dog with a question mark. I wouldn't throw it out without some analysis, but it's probably not going to work for you. And then on the right-hand side at the top, if it's a high cost to implement, but it's got high margin, then it's worth doing a little more digging and making a decision on. So there's no absolutes here. I didn't say no, I just said caution or question mark. But this framework might help you. If you go to the next slide, I'll show you where I've kind of mocked up where I might, just to illustrate what I'm talking about when I say put the assortments in the different squares. You can see I've just some examples of what this matrix might look like when you're done. Okay, next slide. There's another tool, and it's online. It's free to use. It's actually the U.S. government provides it. It's the Census Business Builder. And you can see I've put on the slide, it's kind of busy, but it shows you where to click when you get there because it's kind of hard to figure out at first. And then left-hand side kind of gives you some of the data that you'll see. And if you'll go to the next slide, I'll show you just a sample of what that information looks like. I did a Census Business Builder filter on Washington County, just chose household consumer expenditures per household on dining out for lunch. So if I'm contemplating opening maybe a small lunch counter or something in my store, this might be something I'd want to investigate. And you'll notice, I don't know if you have, but I pointed to, well, let me say this, on the bottom left-hand side, there's some color coding, and on the map, you'll notice there's different colors. So those colors correspond to the ranges of spending that you'll find on the left-hand side. So Washington County itself, the spending is $793 to $824 per year per person on lunch dining out. And you compare that to the next county over, which is Marshall County, it's $831 to $866. So they spend more in the next county over. So depending on where you're locating yourself, your business, you might want to consider areas outside of your range if it's possible that they might be willing to drive or in your area for lunchtime. So again, that's just an illustration of what you might find. Next slide. Another really neat tool is called Reference USA. It's not available online for anybody, but most libraries I've ever visited have this in their collection. It's an online database. It's really cool because you can put in, you can ask for filtering. For example, in this case, I did a filter on do-it-yourselfers. Maybe I'm thinking about adding an assortment of hardware items or do-it-yourself stuff in my store. I can do a search, and I can see, if you look at the upper right-hand corner, there's actually 11,253 people or households that have an affinity for doing things themselves. And they actually include 2,500 email addresses in that list. And you can't see it here, but you can view results and you'll get actually a list of addresses and people that you can target, or you can at least understand the size of the market from the summary page. Next slide. Oh, and I did want to mention it's in libraries. I think I said that, but we also have access to it at the SBDC, so you can always ask us to help you with that. And so this slide talks about financial projections, and we start with the project costs. So when you're planning a transition, there's usually costs involved in, especially if you're going to add new assortments, things like that. So you want to talk about your equipment. What are the costs of the equipment, the labor, pre-revenue labor that might be required to kind of set things up, any fees and expenses, and any working capital you need to put money in the till until you can generate your own cash. The middle section talks about funding. So what are your sources of funding? I mentioned earlier, in a business transition to a employee-owned business or a community-owned business or a collaborative-owned business, what I call them, you might need more than one funding source. And typically you might need, maybe the seller might have to finance some of this. The bank may need to get a bank loan and then maybe bring in some investors, maybe some community investors into the project. And then the right-hand side, like I mentioned earlier, what you get out of the projections or what you're looking for is a pro forma of your profit and loss statement, your balance sheet, your cash flow statement, and the spreadsheet that we'll make available to you will give you 3 years of that, 3 separate years of financials. And then it does allow you to plan in categories. We recommend you keep that limited to 4 or less. Okay, next slide. And there may be an additional focus in your business plan if you're transitioning to a shared ownership model. And we talked about that before in previous webinars, but there's some different aspects of a business plan when you're looking at this kind of a transition. You want to talk about how you're going to establish governance if you haven't already. How are you going to cultivate that transparency and accountability that's mandatory for your success as a shared ownership model? You may have some new owners you need to train in how to be an owner. Funding strategies, and because, as I mentioned earlier, those can be complex, so you might have to put a little focus on that. And then community relations, because a lot of times these shared ownership models are very dependent on the community and the relationships they have with those communities. And, as Imogene mentioned earlier, there's assistance available to do your planning. The SBDC, SCORE, Network Kansas are a few places to go. And next slide. And finally, the executive summary. And I always say, you read it first, but you write it last. So you don't want to write this until you've written the rest of the plan. Otherwise, you're going to rewrite your summary 100 times. But it's 1 page of text, just kind of walking through the high points of your business plan, and then 1 page of a financial summary. And the spreadsheet that we'll provide you has that 1 page financial summary that bankers that we work with, they love it. Again, you want to summarize key points. You want to talk about your objectives, be very clear what your outcome is what you expect for an outcome, which could be most likely a conversion to a new entity, and then target dates. And then you want to talk about funding. Where's that money coming from? And then again, read first, but you'll write it last. And with that, I'll hand it over to Erica, and she's going to talk about some more grocery specific aspects of business planning.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Jack, for that presentation. Tons of great information there. SBDC just has so much information on this topic, so we're glad that you could share some of it with us today. So the various steps and tools that we just heard about can be applied to many types of businesses. But now I just wanted to spend a few minutes talking about some grocery specific considerations when developing a business plan. So I'll give a few examples to show how these concepts can be applied when you're opening or transitioning a rural grocery store. And some of this will be a sneak preview of webinars coming up as well. So next slide. So one of the first and probably most obvious things you'll have to consider as a grocer is where you'll get your grocery supplies. And this slide just shows some of the most common distributors across Kansas. Next slide. And somebody asked this question in the chat already, but a challenge that some grocers face is, especially in rural areas, is meeting the distributor's minimum buying requirements. Not all distributors have minimums, but some do. And this basically just means that you need to order a certain amount from the distributor per week. But if you're a smaller community, maybe you don't need to stock that much. So it can be tricky to figure out how you're going to supply the store and what's the most cost-effective option. But some grocers have come up with a few workaround solutions. We have a short list here, but there are probably others. If you know of any others, feel free to share them in the chat. But we've heard of independent grocery stores combining their orders to meet the minimum. So maybe one store receives a full shipment from the distributor, the other store drives to pick up their part of the order. We also know that some stores will drive to other nearby stores like a Walmart or an Aldi, for instance, to get groceries so that they could at least supply the basics at their store. And then finally, some stores focus on sourcing locally. So local produce, meat and dairy, even grains to stock their shelves without a wholesale distributor. So just a few other options to go through. Next slide. And of course, another big consideration for your business is who is your competition. This slide shows some recent data from a survey conducted by University of Minnesota Extension, where they asked rural grocers in Minnesota about the challenges they face. And probably not very surprisingly, they found that large chain supermarkets and dollar stores are major challenges. So, people nowadays are much more mobile and many people are commuting to nearby towns for work. So it's easy to just stop by the supermarket and pick up groceries there. Dollar stores, part of their business model, some of them is to locate in rural communities and they can stock non-perishable items at low prices. Many aren't stocking produce or meat that have lower margins. So it's just really important to know, to be aware of these things when you're planning your grocery store. Know your competition and how you can set yourself apart. Next slide. So in light of these considerations and these challenges, talking about who your distributor is and your competition in town, these have implications for the type of services you'll provide. So are you going to provide a full service grocery store? So in other words, are you going to be selling all of the food groups as well as non-food items like your, paper towels, cleaning supplies, pet food, that sort of thing? Or are you going to have a more limited selection? So instead of, 30 types of barbecue sauce, maybe you only need 2 types or maybe just 1 type. And depending on your community, it might make sense to scale back and just offer the basics, and that can be okay. So to give you an example, this photo is a store in Winchester, Illinois, the Great Scott Community Market, and this is the route that they took to have a more focused format. So this store, as you can see, has a very small footprint. The building it used to be an old it used to be an old shoe store. And this is where they located the grocery store in 2018 after the previous grocery store closed. So next slide, please. So they didn't want to have the same business model as the previous store that had closed, especially because there was a nearby dollar store that was carrying dry and frozen items at low prices. So this store's business plan really focuses on fresh food, local produce, meat, and dairy. They get fresh eggs once a week from someone in town. They can even sometimes sell extra produce from backyard gardens. So this is really what helps set them apart from their competition, and it cuts back on distribution costs. As you can see in this photo, they're still stocking dried and canned goods, but the focus is on items that you might run out of when you're making dinner that evening. And so I also want to mention on this slide that for our 8th webinar on March 18th, we will actually be hearing from Sean Park, who was really instrumental in helping guide this town to get the store set up. So Sean is a program manager for the Illinois Institute for Rural Affairs, and I really encourage you to attend that webinar on March 18th. Next slide. So now in doing your market research, you might also think beyond grocery and identify other services that will get people through the door. So on this slide, you can see several ideas that other grocery stores have implemented. So, selling locally made products and stamps. You could have a cafe and a deli. So when people come in to grab a sandwich or a coffee, they are picking up groceries on their way out. We've also heard of grocery stores co-locating with other businesses. So for instance, a hardware store, a flower shop, a pharmacy. So there are a lot of other services that you could provide that are not strictly grocery. Next slide. So I have just a few examples in the last couple of minutes here, but on the left, we have White's Food Liner in St. John, Kansas. So St. John has a population of about 1,200 people, and their grocery store closed in 2016. And so, you know, community members were rightfully very worried about this and were trying to figure out what to do. So they conducted a feasibility study and realized that it would actually make more sense to relocate the grocery store closer to the highway rather than reopen a store downtown where the previous store had been. And this would catch more traffic that would increase sales by 40%. So the community approached White's Food Liner, which is a small chain based in Kansas, to see if they'd be interested in coming to St. John. And White's Food Liner felt really strongly that something else needed to be there, a companion business needed to be there. So that's how they decided to add the gas pumps. They, which you can see in the photo here, they discovered that with the gas pumps at the grocery store, grocery sales would increase by 16%. So as you can also see from the photo, there's also a pharmacy here, which is a separate business. But that, you know, that's another way to get people through the door. So this is a great story, and we'll actually be talking more about this particular story in the webinar next week. Next slide. Oh, I'm sorry, go back one more slide. I had one more example there. And this is my final example from Blue Rapids, Kansas. In this example, a grocery store closed and a flower shop decided to start selling fresh food at the flower shop. So they moved to a different location so that they could have more floor space. And now the flower shop and the grocery store are operating in the same building. So they sell grocery items like meat and produce, and they sell other items as well, small gift items like soap, candles, jewelry. So this is kind of an example of adding grocery to an existing business. All right, next slide. Okay, well, we have just a couple of minutes remaining. So I wanted to see if we might be able to get through just a couple of questions. And Jack and Imogene, if you want to turn your videos back on. But I have one question here from Regina asking, has anyone had issues with more of the online ordering from Amazon instead of shopping local? And I would say that that's definitely an issue that I have heard about. I think that's another competitor that we have to think about. And we've even seen a much greater interest in e-commerce for grocers all over the place, urban and rural as well, so that they can kind of compete. Let's see. Do we have any other questions here? How about in the last minute, would you, Jack and Imogene, would you be able to just share with us how folks can get in touch with you if they have more questions after the webinar?
Sure. So like I said before, I'm with the Kansas SBDC in Johnson County Community College. Probably the best way to access the SBDC statewide is through the website, and it's kansassbdc.net. I'll put it in the chat real quick. And if you'd like to be a client, there's no charge for that. you know, if you work in Kansas, your business is Kansas, you live in Kansas, the Kansas SBDC will help you at no cost. It's prepaid by your tax dollars.
Yeah, and for Network Kansas, I'll drop the info in the chat there too, but you can email them at info@networkkansas.com. I'll put the phone number in there too, or you can even email me. That's fine, and that's Harris, IHARRIS @networkkansas.com.
Great. Well, thank you both, Jack and Imogene, for being here today and sharing this great information. If you want to go to the next slide, Jess. So we're halfway through the webinar series now, and we actually just sent out a survey to everyone who attended the first 4 webinars. So we would love to hear your feedback on how it's going, and if you could fill that out and send it back to us, that would help us improve the remaining webinars in this series. So all of our upcoming webinars will be held on Thursdays at 1:30 p.m. Central, and you can see the full schedule and descriptions at ruralgrocery.org. Next slide. And next week, we will talk about funding the transition, and we will feature the recently completed grocery store that I talked about, which used more than 10 types of funding to make their store a reality. So we'll have a panel of funders joining us who can share more details on different funding opportunities at the federal, state, and local levels. And you know, some of these funding opportunities that we'll discuss are available across the country, but this webinar will have more of a Kansas-specific focus for funding. And so hopefully you can join us for that as well. And thank you all so much for joining us today. And thank you again to Imogene and Jack, and we hope to see you all next week. Thanks so much.